Hey everyone, welcome back. By now you're already half sunk into the pillows, the light in your room is dimming, and the sounds of medieval hypocrisy should be humming gently in your mind like a lullaby. We've wandered through Paris, Nuremberg, and London, where the church and the city fathers busied themselves pretending to condemn brothels while happily taxing them. Tonight, let's drift over to Italy, because naturally, if anyone was going to make vice into an art form, it was going to be the Italians. Venice, for instance, was not merely a city. It was a stage set afloat on water, full of masks, shadows, and commerce. Everything in Venice had a price, and pleasure was no exception. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Venetian government had not only accepted brothels but woven them into the fabric of the city's economy. After all, sailors poured into Venice from every corner of the Mediterranean, and the authorities knew very well that young men with money in their pockets and weeks at sea behind them were unlikely to spend all their earnings on fish and devotional candles. So, Venice regulated it. Prostitutes were allowed, but, as usual, they had to follow rules that marked them off from respectable women. The Venetian Senate decreed that prostitutes must display themselves from the windows of certain districts, wearing bright yellow scarves. Yes, yellow again. Medieval Europe had a strange obsession with that color when it came to marking people. Jews were forced to wear yellow badges, prostitutes yellow scarves, and lepers sometimes yellow cloaks. Clearly, if society was confused about you, they just draped you in yellow and called it solved. Venice, though, was inventive. Prostitutes there didn't just sit idly in their windows. They leaned out, sometimes baring their breasts to attract clients on the street below. Travel writers at the time recorded their shock at this, though one suspects their shock was mixed with a certain amount of deliberate loitering in those neighborhoods for research purposes. But Venice being Venice, there was competition. Courtesans began to appear, women of education and refinement, who sold not just their bodies but their company, their wit, and their ability to entertain noblemen. These women were not confined to yellow scarves. They dressed elegantly, wrote poetry, and sometimes became celebrities. The Venetian authorities frowned, tried to regulate them, and largely failed. Because naturally, wealthy men preferred witty conversation and silk gowns to striped hoods and a drafty alley. It created a hierarchy within the profession itself. On the one end, the licensed prostitutes of the brothel districts. On the other, the courtesans, who operated in the drawing rooms of Venice, reciting Petrarchan sonnets while charging fees that could have bought a small farm. One can almost hear the city fathers sighing into their ledgers. We told them to wear yellow scarves. Why won't anyone listen? Meanwhile, across Italy, cities like Florence and Rome were having their own moral tangles. Florence, that shining beacon of Renaissance art, also had municipal brothels. They were located in certain streets, regulated by the city, and patrolled to keep things in check. In theory, they were there to protect respectable women from harassment. In practice, of course, harassment still happened. Regulation always looked neater on parchment than it did on cobblestones. Rome, though, is where things get particularly delicious in their irony. The seat of the papacy. The city of Peter and Paul. And also a thriving market for prostitution, often serviced by clerics themselves. Church councils thundered against the sin, but popes and cardinals were known to maintain mistresses quite openly. One pope, Sixtus IV, even licensed a brothel in Rome itself and taxed the prostitutes to fund the city's defenses. Imagine defending the walls of Christendom with proceeds from a brothel tax. It's almost poetic in its absurdity. Sixtus, by the way, was the same pope who authorized the Sistine Chapel. So, next time you gaze up at Michelangelo's frescoes, you might pause to reflect that part of that glorious ceiling was funded by the city's oldest profession. Art and flesh, intertwined in the ledger. The papacy's relationship with vice was always complicated. On paper, they thundered. In practice, they tolerated. The College of Cardinals sometimes looked more like a collection of wealthy bachelors with elaborate palaces and a taste for luxury. Reformers railed against it, but nothing really changed until much later. And even then, change was slow. If we drift south, to Naples, we find something slightly different. Naples was a rougher city, full of soldiers and mercenaries, and the brothels reflected that. They were often run by widows or enterprising women who rented out rooms and provided ale, operating somewhere between a tavern and a house of ill repute. Regulations existed, but enforcement was lax. Naples was not Venice. It lacked that meticulous record-keeping. Things were messier, louder, and more violent. Spain, too, had its variations. In cities like Seville, municipal brothels were established and carefully managed. The reasoning was the same: keep disorder in check, funnel men into designated spaces, and extract revenue. But Spain added its own twist. With the Reconquista in progress, soldiers returning from campaigns filled the brothels in droves. The crown quietly accepted it as part of the cost of maintaining armies. After all, nothing like a tax on pleasure to patch up the royal treasury. And through it all, the same paradox remained: sinful, yet tolerated; forbidden, yet profitable; a moral stain, but a financial asset. Medieval Europe lived quite comfortably with this contradiction, perhaps because it mirrored so many others. Nobles who swore oaths of loyalty but plotted rebellion. Clerics who preached poverty while living in splendor. Kings who vowed justice while seizing land. In the end, the brothels were just another piece of the pattern. It's worth remembering, though, that while we can smirk at the hypocrisy, the women themselves were not living in satire. Their lives were often hard, their choices limited. Some carved out surprising degrees of independence, but many more faced violence, poverty, and the constant reminder that society used them while denying them dignity. Cities buried them outside consecrated ground. Priests took their money but refused them last rites. It is a reminder that behind every ledger entry was a human life, often lived on the margins. And so, we have Venice with its yellow scarves, Rome with its papal brothels, Spain with its soldiers, and Florence with its Renaissance contradictions. Each city managed desire the same way it managed grain or salt. Categorize it. Regulate it. Profit from it. Pretend it's under control. And move on. Let's pause here, and I'll ask you a gentle question as you're drifting deeper into rest. If you had been a Venetian senator, sitting in a hall lined with maps and smelling faintly of sea salt, would you have voted to force prostitutes into yellow scarves? Or would you have quietly shrugged, knowing the courtesans were already outshining them in silk and poetry? Tell me what you think in the comments. I'm curious. And with that, let's float onward, into the next chapter of this long, sleepy journey, where hypocrisy continues to bloom in the strangest corners of medieval life. Hey, everyone! Let's stay under the covers, keep the room quiet, and drift a little deeper. We've wandered through Paris and London, where brothels were kept under careful watch and dressed in striped hoods or yellow scarves. Now, let's slide northward, into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire, where everything was a little more fragmented, a little more bureaucratic, and somehow even more absurd. Because in Germany, they didn't just license brothels. They sometimes owned them outright. Cities like Augsburg, Frankfurt, and Nuremberg turned prostitution into a civic enterprise. The Council Fathers, merchants, burghers, men with fur-lined robes and a fondness for long meetings, decided it was better not only to control lust but to manage it as efficiently as they managed grain markets or toll bridges. So, municipal brothels were born. Augsburg, for instance, had one known as the Frauenhaus, literally the women's house. The city rented it, staffed it, regulated it, and collected profits from it. The building was often large, sometimes with 2 floors, with separate chambers for women to live and work. And the city council oversaw it all with an air of dry civic duty, as though managing a municipal sewer system. One can almost hear the minutes of the meeting. Agenda Item 3, Repair to the South Gate. Agenda Item 4, the Frauenhaus requires a new roof tile. Funds to be allocated from last quarter's receipts. To modern ears, it sounds like satire. But to Augsburg city fathers, it was simply prudent governance. The logic was clear. Men were going to seek out prostitutes anyway. Better to confine it to one location, charge fees, and keep a degree of oversight. After all, this was the land of guilds, charters, and regulations. If you could regulate who made bread, why not regulate who sold love? But regulation, in the German sense, was rarely gentle. Rules piled upon rules. Prostitutes in municipal houses were not free agents. They were registered, monitored, and restricted. They could not leave the Frauenhaus without permission. They were forbidden from wearing respectable women's clothing. They could not attend church in the main pews, only at the back, and sometimes only at certain hours. In Nuremberg, prostitutes were required to live within the Frauenhaus itself. They couldn't own property, and their earnings were heavily taxed. At times, The women were even compelled to undergo health inspections, a practice that was more humiliating than protective. The rhetoric was always about safeguarding society, but the reality was closer to controlling a workforce the council didn't want to admit it employed. And yet, within these walls, life took on its own rhythms. The Frauenhaus had a kind of dormitory structure. Women lived together, ate together, and sometimes built friendships. Some stayed for years, others for months, depending on their fortunes. A few even managed to leave with enough savings to remarry or set up small trades. But for most, the system trapped them in a cycle. They paid rent, fees, and taxes, with the city pocketing the profits. The hypocrisy is hard to miss. Councils forbade prostitutes from entering taverns or dancing at fairs, yet the same councils pocketed their money. Preachers denounced fornication, yet civic officials hired guards to protect the Frauenhaus from rowdy customers. A society that wanted vice contained, but also wanted it profitable. One of the strangest features of German municipal brothels was the overlap with other civic duties. In some cities, women from the Frauenhaus were called upon to perform certain rituals, like leading mock parades during carnival. Imagine it, the same women forbidden from wearing jewelry in daily life were suddenly trotted out in costume to entertain the town once a year. It was part punishment, part spectacle, and entirely bizarre. And it wasn't just men of the lower classes who came calling. Records show that apprentices, merchants, and even council members themselves were regular customers. Clerics, too, made appearances, despite the rules. The lines between moral supervision and personal indulgence blurred constantly. Let's not forget the physical conditions. The Frauenhäuser were not luxurious. Think less velvet couch and more wooden bench. Shared rooms, straw mattresses, and ale that was more water than beer. They were noisy, crowded, and smelled of sweat, smoke, and tallow candles. Hardly romantic. Yet for many men, they provided the only chance at companionship, however fleeting. And the women, despite the restrictions, sometimes carved out small measures of agency. There are stories of prostitutes in Nuremberg negotiating better treatment, or collectively petitioning for lower rents. It's easy to imagine them as powerless, but some learned to navigate the bureaucracy with surprising skill. After all, if your very survival depended on pleasing both clients and city clerks, you learned quickly how to bargain. Meanwhile, outside the Frauenhäuser, independent prostitution still flourished. Women who didn't want to be confined worked illegally, meeting clients in taverns, inns, or private homes. City authorities railed against them, calling them wild women or loose women, but they never fully disappeared. Because, of course, the moment you regulate something, people find ways around it. And then there's the detail that always makes me pause. The brothels were often located alarmingly close to churches. In some towns, you could walk from confession straight to the Frauenhaus in less than 5 minutes. Not that anyone would have admitted it, but the geography spoke for itself. Sin and salvation, side by side, because medieval life thrived on contradiction. If you walked the streets of Augsburg or Nuremberg at night, you'd see the pattern. The marketplace shuttered, candles flickering in upper windows, the Frauenhaus door guarded by a watchman. Customers slipping in and out, trying not to be noticed, but noticed all the same. And a clerk, somewhere, making sure the taxes were counted. Beyond the rules and hypocrisy, there was another layer to all this, the sheer ordinariness. For medieval people, brothels were not exotic. They were part of the cityscape, as normal as a butcher's stall or a blacksmith's forge. Children grew up knowing where the Frauenhaus was. Wives and apprentices passed by it on their way to market. It was hidden, and yet not hidden at all. And if you think this made medieval Germans prudish, think again. Carnival season, especially, brought out bawdy songs and plays where prostitutes were mocked, courted, and parodied. The same city that fined a woman for soliciting outside the Frauenhaus might laugh heartily at a carnival play featuring a prostitute as a stock character. Morality was strict on paper and flexible in practice. Now, let's soften our gaze and think about this. If you were a young woman in a city like Augsburg, poor and without family, and the council offered you a place in the Frauenhaus, regulated, taxed, but providing food and shelter, would you have accepted? Or would you have risked the dangers of working illegally, always looking over your shoulder for the city guards? Tell me in the comments what you think. And as you drift further into rest, remember, the Frauenhäuser weren't built because medieval people were more sinful than us. They were built because medieval people were more bureaucratic than we imagine. They turned lust into a line item, desire into revenue, and contradiction into policy. Let's keep floating onward, because the story of medieval brothels is still unfolding, and each city added its own peculiar twist to the tale. Let's settle back in. We've drifted through laws and kings, mayors and bishops, but we haven't really stepped through the door of a medieval brothel yet. Tonight, let's quietly wander inside one. Don't worry, the doors were often wide open, lanterns burning, and nobody was pretending not to notice. Brothels in Europe were, rather astonishingly, part of the neighborhood, sometimes right on the main street, beside the baker, or tucked in behind the cathedral. Because nothing says civic harmony like fresh bread, church bells, and municipal prostitution. The first impression you'd probably get wasn't glamour. Forget velvet curtains and mysterious perfume. Think more, timbered houses, uneven floors, the smell of smoke from the kitchen hearth, and too many candles burning down too quickly. Brothels were practical businesses, and their daily life looked less like a medieval romance and more like a tavern mixed with a boarding house, just with a different main service on offer. Let's picture a morning there. Sunlight pushes in through wooden shutters, because curtains weren't exactly a priority. Women wake up in cramped shared rooms. Some brothels had half a dozen beds in one chamber, separated only by thin partitions, if at all. Privacy was not really on the menu. Water was fetched, faces splashed, hair braided quickly. Many of the women owned only a couple of dresses, usually rough wool or linen, dyed cheaply in colors like yellow or brown. In fact, yellow became such a common identifier for sex workers in parts of Europe that some cities outright forced them to wear it. Nothing subtle, just municipal fashion policing at its dullest. After dressing came chores. Yes, chores. Because a brothel still needed sweeping, firewood carried in, bread baked, and linen scrubbed. Imagine scrubbing linens in cold river water while your main worry is not catching pneumonia before your next paying customer. Many women doubled as servants, cooks, and housekeepers in addition to their work with clients. The brothel keeper, often a matron or madam, would make sure the house didn't collapse into filth. Well, filthier than usual. By midday, things picked up. A few customers trickled in after market. Picture a butcher who'd just sold his cuts of meat, jingling coins in his pouch, deciding he might as well stop by. Or a student from the local university. Yes, those boys were infamous customers, sneaking away from his lectures on Aristotle. There was very little secrecy. Everyone in town knew where the brothel was, and the brothel's front door was rarely closed. Inside, there were rules. Many municipal brothels had official lists, posted like tavern regulations. No fighting inside. No stealing from the women. No underage boys allowed. No staying the whole night unless you paid extra. Some even limited the kinds of services, because naturally, the city council thought they could legislate human desire with tidy little rules. It rarely worked, but the parchments looked very serious on the wall. Food and drink were part of the deal, too. Customers often expected ale, bread, maybe a bit of stew, before or after. Some brothels functioned almost like inns. You could eat, gossip, and leave without actually using the main service. Imagine townsfolk dropping by just for the dinner special because the kitchen was better stocked than their own. And indeed, chroniclers mention that brothels were social hubs, where deals were struck, secrets traded, and gossip flowed faster than wine. The women themselves lived on a thin edge of survival. Their earnings went first to the brothel keeper, who took a cut for room, board, and management. Another portion might go to city taxes, since yes, municipalities happily collected revenue from these places. After all, why let morality get in the way of a steady cash stream? What little remained in the woman's pocket often went to clothes, food, or savings for the dream of leaving the profession. Few succeeded. Many drifted from one brothel to another as debts piled up. One of the more fascinating, if bleak, aspects was health. Brothels were paradoxically advertised as safer than street work, but safer is relative. Customers carried diseases freely. Medieval people had no concept of bacteria or viruses, only vague theories about corrupted air or bad humors. Syphilis, for instance, didn't hit Europe until the late 15th century, but gonorrhea and other infections circulated widely. The authorities sometimes forced women to undergo health inspections, though these were about as effective as checking someone's pulse and declaring them immortal. Still, The effort looked impressive in the city records. Some houses tried to enforce hygiene. Water for washing was provided. Sheets were, at least in theory, changed weekly. Of course, weekly in a house serving dozens of men a day was ambitious. But in the ledger, the rule stood, clean linens by Sunday. Whether anyone obeyed was another matter. Now, daily life wasn't all drudgery. There were festivals, and brothels didn't miss them. Carnival season often saw a rush of customers, with masks and disguises adding to the revelry. Brothels became lively taverns during holidays, with dancing, music, and far too much wine. City authorities sometimes turned a blind eye because, frankly, they were celebrating too. In some towns, the brothel even hosted official events. Imagine the mayor stopping by to deliver a speech reminding everyone to stay decent, while standing in a hall full of giggling students and weary merchants. Clients themselves came in all varieties. Some were polite, even shy. Records show customers who spent hours just talking or holding hands. Others were boorish, drunk, or violent. Brothel keepers tried to manage this, because unruly clients risked fines or closure. Some women kept regulars, men they knew well, who treated them kindly and paid steadily. It wasn't affection, exactly, but it was routine, and in medieval life, routine was a kind of safety. One curious detail was decoration. Brothels didn't always look shabby. Some were brightly painted, with murals of flowers, saints, rather ironically, or animals. In Florence, one brothel had walls painted with playful scenes of cupids. Another in Paris hung cheap tapestries to create a sense of wealth. It was theater, convincing customers they were entering a special place, not just another creaky timber house with drafty windows. And then, of course, there was the endless bureaucracy. Every so often, city inspectors turned up. They checked the accounts, counted the women, and made sure the rules were followed, at least on paper. Some cities fined brothel keepers if a woman was caught outside wearing clothes too fine, or if the house hosted gambling tables. So the brothel lived under constant petty regulation. You could sell sex under license, but heaven forbid you offered dice games without permission. Despite all this regulation, brothels were porous places. Thieves came looking for drunk customers to rob. Priests sometimes crept in under cover of night, a detail no chronicler failed to mention. And of course, fights broke out when jealous husbands or lovers tried to drag women home. A brothel was as much a stage for human folly as any tavern or market. Let's not forget the neighbors. Imagine living next door. The noise, the comings and goings, the occasional brawl spilling into the street. Some neighbors complained bitterly. Others quietly profited, selling bread, candles, or ale to the steady stream of visitors. The line between disgust and opportunism was thin. And what about the women's downtime? Accounts suggest they spent evenings together when customers thinned. They sang songs, gossiped, or played dice. Some read letters. Yes, a surprising number were literate, having picked up enough to keep accounts or correspond with family. For many, companionship with fellow workers was their closest human bond. Outsiders shunned them, but inside the house, they found community. So, the daily life of a medieval brothel was neither glamorous nor entirely miserable. It was grinding work, wrapped in routine, overseen by city laws, punctuated by festivals and fights, and forever balanced between social necessity and social shame. As we drift onward, let's pause with a question for you. If you lived in a medieval town, would you have dared to step through those doors, or just hurried past, eyes averted? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, if you're still awake. Let's keep going. We've stepped inside the medieval brothel, peeked at the daily routines, and maybe overheard the rules painted neatly on a wall no one followed. But who, exactly, walked through those doors? Who climbed the creaky stairs, jingled their coins, and left their dignity, or what passed for it, at the threshold? Tonight, let's drift into the strange cross-section of medieval society that kept brothels in business. The answer, of course, is almost everyone. Students, priests, merchants, knights, laborers. If you think respectable citizens carefully avoided these places, well, think again. In many cities, the client list read like the town directory. The only thing they had in common was the ability, or at least the attempt, to pay. Let's start with the university students. Medieval universities were not cozy little colleges. They were chaotic clusters of young men, crammed into towns, away from home, given books, lectures, and very little supervision. Picture hundreds of restless teenagers, fueled by wine, a vague understanding of Latin, and an endless supply of bravado. Towns that hosted universities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Prague, noticed very quickly that students made excellent customers. Municipal records often lump scholars right alongside butchers and bakers as the main clientele of licensed brothels. And students weren't subtle. There are complaints of them roaming the streets in loud groups, bursting into brothels, singing songs, breaking furniture, and then slipping away without paying. In Bologna, the brothel keeper actually petitioned the city council, begging them to discipline the students who caused damage. The council's solution? They fined the brothel, not the students. Naturally. Because if you're going to punish anyone, best punish the one paying taxes. Some students even became romantically entangled with the women. Chroniclers loved to scold them for neglecting their studies. One Paris rector claimed the entire university was sliding into decay because the boys preferred brothels over Aristotle. Imagine the lecture, "Gentlemen, you failed your rhetoric exam because you were too busy frequenting the municipal house of sin." Not exactly the pep talk of the year. Then there were the clergy. Yes, the priests, monks, and even bishops who, strictly speaking, had taken vows of celibacy. Did that stop them? Absolutely not. Brothel records across Europe show a steady stream of clergy customers. In fact, some cities issued repeated warnings to priests not to be seen entering brothels in broad daylight. The wording is telling, not "don't go at all," just "don't make a spectacle of it before Vespers." One 14th-century bishop of Winchester in England even owned property near a cluster of brothels and happily collected rent from the madams. The irony was not lost on locals, who jokingly called them the stews of Winchester. Technically sinful, practically profitable. And, as one dry chronicler wrote, the clergy are ever zealous in their concern for revenue. A gentle medieval way of saying, they loved money more than their own rules. Merchants and tradesmen made up another large share. These were not always rich men. A cobbler with a good week of sales, or a fishmonger after market day, might slip into the brothel with coins clinking in his pouch. For many working-class men, a brothel visit was less about luxury and more about access, an accepted outlet, a service stamped with civic approval. The town might frown on gambling, drinking, and dancing, but brothels? Entirely fine, so long as the tax collector got his cut. Knights and soldiers were a category all their own. Whenever armies gathered, on campaign, or simply stationed in a city, the demand for prostitution spiked dramatically. Authorities often set up temporary brothels near encampments, as if part of the standard supply chain, alongside bread, arrows, and beer. Some rulers openly defended this, claiming it prevented greater sins like adultery or, heaven forbid, homosexuality. The logic was odd, but it satisfied anxious bishops. Better the men waste money in a licensed brothel than fall into more scandalous habits. And then, of course, there were nobles. They didn't usually visit the municipal houses. Too public, too cheap. Instead, they arranged private liaisons, or kept mistresses under the polite label of companions. But still, rumors circulated of kings sneaking into common brothels disguised in cloaks, eager for anonymity and adventure. Chroniclers always relished these tales, hinting at monarchs slipping through the shadows, only to be recognized immediately by their extravagant boots. Let's pause a moment on anonymity. You might imagine medieval customers slinking in under cover of darkness, pulling hats low, mumbling excuses. In reality, many strolled in quite openly. Brothels were public institutions. There was little shame in entering one, at least for men. A husband might be judged for neglecting his family, but an unmarried man? Perfectly normal. A bachelor evening, as ordinary as visiting a tavern. If anyone judged, it was usually because he was too cheap to pay properly, not because he went in the first place. Of course, not all customers behaved. Some tried to haggle aggressively, demanding more for less. Others became violent, lashing out when refused. Brothel keepers complained constantly about disorderly clients. A few cities responded with official punishments. In Nuremberg, for instance, a man caught abusing a prostitute could be fined heavily and paraded through town as an example. Yet the same system still welcomed him back the next week, so long as he had coins. Medieval justice was practical like that, punish enough to save face, but not enough to lose a taxpayer. One particularly odd group of clients were pilgrims. Yes, pilgrims. Men on religious journeys sometimes made detours into brothels. The irony is almost too easy. A man walking to Santiago de Compostela with scallop shell pinned proudly to his cloak, stopping midway in a brothel for rest. Preachers railed against it, but the reality was obvious. Travel made men lonely, and towns along pilgrimage routes offered temptations at every corner. Brothels thrived on these wayfarers, who were unlikely to be recognized by neighbors and more likely to spend freely. Let's also note the occasional woman customer. Rare, but not unheard of. Records hint at noblewomen arranging encounters, usually discreetly. Sometimes women came seeking comfort, companionship, or curiosity. Chroniclers, of course, judged them far more harshly than men, but the fact remains, brothels weren't strictly male-only. Human desire ignored civic categories. So, in the end, the clientele represented a fascinating cross-section of medieval life. Students dodging exams, priests ignoring vows, merchants spending profits, knights blowing plunder, husbands sneaking in, and travelers passing through. Each walked through the same doorway, coins in hand, leaving the town to pretend nothing unusual was happening. And here's the strangest part. Despite the moral sermons, the fiery preachers, the occasional crackdown, brothels rarely struggled for business. The demand was constant, as reliable as sunrise. Towns could shut one down, and within weeks another would spring up, like mushrooms after rain. Because in a world of rigid laws, endless rules, and harsh penalties, the brothel was the one place where people admitted, quietly, that human nature wasn't going to change. Let's drift on with a question for you. If you were a medieval student, away from home, broke and reckless, would you have been the one breaking furniture in a brothel, or the one actually trying to study Aristotle? Be honest in the comments. I suspect the answer might be embarrassing. Let's settle back under the covers. By now, you've wandered the streets, peeked inside brothels, and imagined the students, merchants, and pilgrims slipping quietly through the doors. Tonight, let's drift into the contradictions of the Church, the institution that spent centuries declaring sin while quietly profiting from or tolerating it. The medieval Church had a peculiar relationship with prostitution. On paper, every monk, priest, and bishop was supposed to frown upon it, condemn it from pulpits, and urge citizens to lead chaste lives. But in practice, they often tolerated it, or worse, exploited it for revenue. It was a delicate balance of moral theater and practical governance, and sometimes it seems they weren't entirely sure which they preferred. Consider the municipal brothel. In many towns, the church itself collected tithes or taxes indirectly through brothel profits. Priests were supposed to pray, advise, and chastise, but some also held property near brothels or lent money to madams. And when you add in the sheer number of clergy who quietly became clients, the contradiction becomes rather spectacular. Imagine a bishop preaching against sin one moment, then counting coins derived from its sale the next. Pope Alexander VI, yes, the infamous Borgia, provides a particularly vivid example. His reign is remembered for scandal, nepotism, and, inevitably, women. Though technically bound by celibacy, he maintained multiple mistresses and fathered children, all while issuing papal edicts against immoral behavior. The irony was not lost on contemporaries, but they were usually too polite, or too frightened, to comment openly. Chroniclers noted it with a kind of resigned amusement. He speaks of virtue with one tongue and embraces vice with the other. Even earlier popes engaged in this subtle double life. In Rome, some authorities licensed brothels and taxed them, sometimes claiming the revenue would go toward church repairs or charitable works. The ledger might read, "From the house of sin, 15 ducats, designated for the chapel of St. Cecilia." The moral gymnastics were impressive. You could almost hear a clerk whispering, "Technically, this is holy funding." On the local level, parish priests were expected to keep women in line, reminding them of sin and urging repentance. But they often turned a blind eye to the women working in municipal brothels, especially when those women attended confession, paid their tithes, and behaved otherwise respectfully. After all, sin was easier to manage in controlled spaces. A brothel outside the city walls? Trouble. A brothel with city oversight and health inspections? Convenient. Some clerics became creative in their reasoning. They argued that prostitution prevented worse sins, such as adultery or violent acts, and thus could be tolerated under the concept of lesser evil. Imagine it. The moral calculus of the Middle Ages boiled down to, better a licensed brothel than a kingdom in rebellion. And somehow, this made sense to the council meetings, the preachers, and the mayors alike. Yet enforcement of morality remained theatrical. Preachers would thunder about lust from the pulpit, warning the congregation to resist temptation. Meanwhile, city records show clerics entering the very brothels they condemned. Letters from visiting bishops sometimes hinted at embarrassment but rarely led to actual reform. The contradiction was celebrated in hushed tones, or at least recorded with dry amusement in official chronicles. Religious holidays added another layer of irony. Carnival season, for example, was meant as a period of joy and festivity but often descended into indulgence. Brothels thrived during this time, hosting music, games, and sometimes elaborate role-playing. Clerics knew it, occasionally joined in, and then returned to preaching on virtue the next week. The church, it seems, had a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization. The moral balancing act extended to the women themselves. While public morality demanded that prostitutes remain outsiders, they were also encouraged to participate in certain church rituals. They could attend Mass at special hours, be married or blessed under controlled conditions, and even receive charity when sick. In essence, the church tried to classify them: dangerous if uncontrolled, useful if contained. It's a categorization that reminds you just how practical medieval people could be when morality interfered with economics. One fascinating example comes from medieval Germany. Records from Augsburg mention the city brothel being under partial oversight of a local monastery. The monastery received some income from fines levied on women who misbehaved, or on men who broke the house rules. The priests provided spiritual guidance, while still benefiting financially from the very activity they were supposed to condemn. You can almost imagine a monk shrugging at the ledger, whispering, "We're doing the Lord's work," and funding the bells at the same time. And then there were the saints, or at least their hagiographies, who commented on the presence of brothels in cities. Some saints warned men away from temptation, others spoke of prostitutes with surprising sympathy. There was a recognition, however understated, that sin was ubiquitous, and that the church's role was as much management as eradication. The dichotomy was clear: preach virtue, manage vice, and hope no one noticed the overlap. Of course, not every clergyman was complicit. Reformers, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries, railed against prostitution, calling for stricter oversight, harsher punishments, and moral education. Orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans took up the cause, preaching against sin in towns and cities. Some towns briefly complied, closing brothels or relocating them outside city walls. But in practice, demand prevailed. Human desire ignored decrees, and the church's best efforts often ended in failure. Legal contradictions were also common. Canon law condemned prostitution, yet civil law licensed it. Clerics were sometimes torn: follow the spiritual mandate or acknowledge the civic reality. Letters from bishops occasionally reveal private frustration. They disliked the existence of brothels, yet recognized their utility for containing sin. A delicate, ironic compromise, the medieval equivalent of shrugging politely and taking the coins. Perhaps the most ironic moment occurs when city officials and clergy held joint investigations. They would inspect a brothel, count the women, ensure taxes were paid, and then hand out moral admonishments to everyone involved. The women would be warned to repent, the men told to be pious, and the clerics themselves left largely unexamined. If bureaucracy and morality were ever tangled in a medieval knot, this was it. The Church's approach to brothels shows an incredible capacity for both hypocrisy and pragmatism. On one hand, preachers thundered, bishops owned property, clerics attended houses discreetly, and popes pocketed profits. On the other hand, these same institutions created frameworks for oversight, health inspection, and partial protection of women. Sin and supervision coexisted in a delicate, slow-moving dance. And that's the lull of it, isn't it? The Church tried to sleepwalk between condemnation and acceptance, pretending to manage vice while quietly depending on it. It's hard not to picture a monk in the evening, candle flickering, ledger open, sighing over fines collected from the women he preached against that morning. Human contradictions, it seems, are timeless. So as you drift further into sleep tonight, imagine the quiet irony of the Middle Ages: priests preaching virtue on Sunday, counting brothel profits on Monday, and watching over a city where everyone knew exactly what went on behind closed doors. and reflect on the strange skill it took to manage moral chaos with spreadsheets, sermons, and public admonishment. Here's a gentle question for you. If you had been a bishop tasked with overseeing a municipal brothel, would you have tried to enforce the rules strictly, or quietly accepted the contradictions and counted the profits? Let me know in the comments, softly, while the rest of the world sleeps. Let's keep sinking into the soft, drowsy rhythm of medieval life. We've wandered through the brothels inside the city, peeked at daily routines, and listened in on the awkward dance between church and civic authorities. Now, let's drift outward, beyond the walls, where prostitution followed commerce, celebration, and pilgrimage. Because medieval brothels were not just static establishments, they moved, multiplied, and adapted to the rhythms of society. Imagine a fair in a small town, perhaps on the feast day of a patron saint. Merchants gather with carts of wool, pottery, or spices. Jugglers perform for coins. Street musicians fill the air with flutes, tambourines, and the occasional off-key lute. And, yes, discreetly tucked between the food stalls or behind temporary tents, women, licensed or not, offer their services. These were the temporary brothels of festival season, often tolerated because they brought order to otherwise chaotic lust. Travelers, too, played a part. Medieval roads were dusty, dangerous, and slow. Pilgrims journeyed long distances to holy sites, sometimes weeks or months at a stretch. Inns were often overcrowded, meals unpredictable, and companionship scarce. Brothel tents and temporary houses became a practical solution for weary travelers. They were places to rest, eat, and indulge in human desires safely. The irony, of course, was that pilgrims on religious missions might fund the very sin they intended to avoid. Merchants on trade routes encountered similar situations. The Rhine, the Danube, and the roads connecting Flanders, Italy, and England were lined with inns, taverns, and often a small, discreet house where travelers could pay for warmth, food, and female companionship. Some of these establishments were licensed by local lords. Others were tolerated under tacit agreement. Like city brothels, these spaces were practical, intended to channel desire into controlled locations rather than leave it to chance. And fairs brought another layer of complexity. Towns held seasonal markets to buy and sell goods. But fairs were also opportunities for socializing, gambling, and indulgence. Temporary brothels cropped up in tents, lean-tos, or even repurposed barns. The women sometimes moved from town to town, following the fair circuit like itinerant performers. They became part of the rhythm of medieval commerce, just as essential as the blacksmiths, apothecaries, or bakers. Pilgrimage routes deserve special mention. Think of Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome. Pilgrims often traveled alone or in small groups, walking hundreds of miles. Loneliness, exhaustion, and curiosity created demand. Brothels cropped up near hostels, inns, and even outside city gates. Sometimes the church attempted oversight, sometimes local authorities tolerated the houses as necessary, and sometimes, naturally, the pilgrims ignored both. Chroniclers often wrote with a mix of amusement and moral horror. Pious men, walking in the name of faith, stopping for temporary, worldly indulgence. And let's not forget military campaigns. Armies on the march, stationed in foreign cities, or besieging fortresses created temporary demand for prostitution. Field brothels, sometimes tents, sometimes commandeered houses, were set up near encampments. Commanders often encouraged this, arguing it prevented worse infractions like sodomy, theft, or desertion. Soldiers, bored and lonely, made these temporary establishments thrive. And municipal authorities, when possible, extracted fees from the tents, counting the revenue in the same dry, pragmatic way as the city's permanent brothels. The women who worked in these itinerant spaces had a life of constant movement. Unlike municipal brothels, they rarely had security or shelter beyond what they could carry. They adapted to tents, barns, and private homes. They traveled with fairs or armies, sometimes for weeks at a time. Their survival depended on luck, skill, and an uncanny ability to manage both clients and local authorities. They were, in many ways, entrepreneurs of human desire. Festival brothels also had their own peculiar etiquette. Women had to distinguish between locals, regular clients, and transient travelers. Fares for temporary services were often higher than in permanent city houses, because supply was limited and risk greater. Rules were looser, but the penalties for breaking them, insults, theft, or violence, could be harsher. Some chroniclers note that women at fairs were often more assertive, knowing that authority was fleeting and mobility gave them power over customers in a way city dwellers did not. And yet, despite the danger and chaos, these spaces were surprisingly organized. Women often coordinated among themselves to avoid disputes, divided clients fairly, and sometimes even collaborated with local tavern keepers or inn proprietors. They understood that survival depended on maintaining a reputation, staying on the right side of temporary authorities, and navigating human desire carefully. The church, predictably, was not thrilled by this mobile, somewhat invisible industry. Priests on pastoral visits railed against fair prostitution, preaching morality from the steps of town halls or temporary pulpits. Popes issued edicts condemning the movement of women with fairs and pilgrimages, urging local authorities to contain the corruption. Naturally, enforcement was inconsistent, and the itinerant nature of the work made oversight tricky. One city could chase them away, they'd simply pop up in the next town. Human desire, as always, proved remarkably persistent. Travelers themselves often wrote letters or diaries that give glimpses into this phenomenon. One monk noted in passing the contradictions of the world: noblemen and merchants, pious men and bawdy students, mingling with women who had no fixed home. Pilgrims sometimes confessed in writing about stops they regretted but secretly appreciated. Chronicles treat it with dry amusement. The world is orderly enough during the day, chaotic at night, and nobody pretends otherwise. The temporary nature of these brothels also influenced city attitudes toward permanent establishments. Some authorities tolerated municipal brothels more because they concentrated the vice, while temporary sites remained harder to police. The paradox is amusing. The more stable and permanent the brothel, the easier it was to regulate. Mobility made enforcement almost impossible. A woman with a tent could evade taxes and moral oversight by moving 5 miles down the road. Cities came to grudgingly respect this logic. Interestingly, festivals and fairs introduced new rituals within brothel culture. Women sometimes engaged in playful role-playing with clients, dressing in bright costumes, singing songs, performing dances. Not that it was glamorous, it was practical theater, designed to attract business and maintain order. Some fairs had annual licenses for women, approved by town councils, effectively making them temporary municipal contractors for sin. It's a reminder that bureaucracy could extend even to tents and temporary structures. The social dimension of temporary brothels was also notable. Women often shared knowledge about clients, warned each other about violent men, and sometimes traveled in groups for safety. Festivals and fairs created a semi-permanent network of information and support, allowing women to navigate risk in ways that city-bound counterparts might envy. Survival, in this context, was as much about clever social organization as anything else. As night fell at fairs, inns, and pilgrimage stops, the rhythm of brothels blended with the general life of the festival. Music played, ale flowed, and city guards occasionally tiptoed past to ensure no major disorder erupted. The ephemeral nature of these houses created a tension between indulgence and oversight. Authorities understood the benefits: contained desire, revenue collection, and a structured outlet for what would otherwise spill chaotically into the streets. So, whether in tents along a pilgrimage route, in barns near fairs, or as temporary structures outside army encampments, brothels were woven into the fabric of medieval life. Mobility brought opportunity, danger, and improvisation. Women adapted, travelers indulged, authorities tolerated, and the church sighed in moral exasperation. The cycle of human desire, regulation, and compromise rolled on, quietly predictable yet endlessly fascinating. And as you drift deeper into sleep tonight, consider this gentle question. If you were traveling the medieval roads, tired, hungry, and lonely, would you seek out a temporary brothel for comfort or push onward in moral resolve? It's a small thought to carry you softly into dreams, and perhaps even a little chuckle at the persistence of human behavior. Let's settle in and drift into the quieter, practical side of medieval brothels. We've seen the daily routines inside the houses, wandered with travelers along fairs and pilgrimage routes, and peeked at the church's awkward tolerance. Tonight, let's gently explore the finances, the very human exchange of coin that kept this curious industry humming across Europe. You might not immediately associate brothels with economics, but in medieval towns, they were surprisingly integral to civic revenue. Municipal authorities recognized that human desire was, above all, predictable. Taxes, fees, fines, each represented a practical way to turn vice into income without the messy business of moral reform. It's a gentle, dry irony. The city councils that condemned sin were also the ones counting ducats from it. Let's start with taxation. Many cities issued licenses for brothels, essentially granting legal permission to operate under official supervision. Brothel keepers paid a fee to the town, usually annual, which entitled them to conduct business within certain guidelines. This fee could be substantial, particularly in prosperous cities like Paris, Florence, or Cologne. The logic was simple. Revenue from the legal organized trade of prostitution was easier to collect than chasing illegal activity in dark alleyways. Once licensed, the brothel often became a mini-cash machine for the city. Women paid a portion of their earnings as rent or dues to the madam, who then forwarded part to municipal coffers. Some cities required additional taxes per customer, counted through meticulously kept ledgers. The system was surprisingly bureaucratic, with sums recorded, fines noted, and periodic inspections. It's almost soothing to imagine a clerk with candlelight, carefully tallying each transaction with a calm sigh, fully aware that he was counting both sin and coins. Fines were another subtle layer of regulation and revenue. If a woman or client broke the rules, if a man refused to pay, or a woman entertained a minor, or someone hosted a gambling table without permission, fines were levied. These fines were often generous, benefiting the city and providing an extra layer of authority for the brothel keeper. The enforcement of morality, it turns out, was profitable in multiple ways. Some cities even made brothels a source of indirect tax. Inns and taverns near brothels paid extra fees, acknowledging the increased traffic of customers. Local bakers, brewers, and merchants supplied food, wine, and basic goods, often at higher prices due to predictable demand. The brothel, in effect, stimulated the local economy while concentrating vice in a single, manageable location. This is the medieval equivalent of urban planning, controlling chaos while lining city coffers. One charmingly bureaucratic example comes from Augsburg in the 15th century. The city levied a tax per woman, per month, and per day a client visited. They required meticulous ledgers with signatures from the madam, the woman, and a municipal clerk. Any deviation, an unpaid client, a missing signature, a woman working outside permitted hours, resulted in a fine. Yet, remarkably, the system worked well enough to be recorded as a model of urban administration. Human desire, predictably, translated to municipal profit. Of course, the church sometimes objected, not because of economics, but morality. Priests reminded townsfolk that sin was not a currency, and that collecting ducats from vice was spiritually perilous. Yet municipal authorities shrugged. Coins were easy to count, sermons were more abstract. Some cities even argued that the revenue funded church repairs, hospitals, or almshouses. Imagine the irony. The very sin condemned in pulpits contributed to charitable works. A gentle paradox to soothe yourself with as you drift toward sleep. There were also seasonal variations in revenue. Carnival season, fairs, pilgrimage routes, and army campaigns created spikes in business. Temporary brothels multiplied like mushrooms after rain, and the city, when possible, collected fees or demanded temporary licenses. Record-keeping had to adjust, clerks became more vigilant, and madams coordinated logistics. The economic rhythm of brothels mirrored the flow of medieval life: festivals, harvests, taxes, and tolls. Predictable, structured, yet tinged with the everyday chaos of human behavior. We can also consider the role of women in this financial ecosystem. Far from passive participants, they were often skilled in accounting, bargaining, and logistics. The madam, for example, managed both people and money, distributing earnings, paying dues to the city, negotiating with merchants, and enforcing rules inside the house. It was an intricate, low-energy dance of practical management. Survival and profit required financial savvy as much as endurance. Let's pause to imagine the ledgers themselves. A clerk, quill in hand, candle flickering, noting the date, the woman, the client count, the fees collected. Rows of numbers, sometimes accompanied by marginalia about behavior or complaints. Occasionally, amusing notes: a client refused payment, a woman quarreled with a madam, or a cat caused chaos in the kitchen. The monotony of accounting lent a calm rhythm to the otherwise lively, chaotic trade. Some cities even experimented with official accounting methods for public transparency. Florence, for instance, required madams to report daily earnings to a municipal office. Cologne mandated audits twice a year. The result was an astonishingly detailed picture of medieval vice, rendered in dry, precise numbers. If human desire could be measured, this was it: meticulous, predictable, and slightly absurd. And yet, despite the organization, brothel economics were vulnerable. Epidemics could decimate client numbers. Wars could displace populations, leaving tents empty and ledgers blank. The death of a madam, a riot, or a decree from a reforming bishop could all disrupt the flow of coins. But in the long term, towns recognized the stability of the trade. Humans, it seems, will always need a controlled outlet for desire, and cities proved adept at monetizing it. Interestingly, the economic impact extended beyond direct revenue. Inns, taverns, bakeries, wine merchants, laundresses, and even tailors supplying uniforms for the women benefited. Festivals and fairs generated temporary but lucrative streams of commerce. The brothel, therefore, was not just a moral conundrum, it was a quiet engine of local finance, humming steadily under the shadow of sermons and scolding. Sometimes, municipal innovation went further. Some towns offered contracts for temporary fairs, paid fines for minor rule infractions in exchange for guaranteed revenue, and even allowed women to carry limited goods for trade along the road. This created a hybrid economy, blending hospitality, commerce, and regulated vice into a strangely efficient system. Human desire, bureaucracy, and commerce intertwined in a low-energy, gently ironic harmony. So, in essence, brothels were more than sites of moral anxiety. They were carefully managed, financially integrated institutions. The city balanced oversight with profit, morality with revenue, and chaos with structure. Clerks tallied numbers, madams distributed earnings, women navigated risk, and townsfolk benefited indirectly. A dry, calm, somewhat ironic orchestration of medieval life. As you drift further into slumber, consider this. Would you have marveled at the precise ledgers and taxes, or simply counted your coins at home, quietly relieved that someone else had done all the difficult arithmetic? Let me know softly in the comments if you're still awake, and perhaps imagine yourself as the calm clerk recording the commerce of sin. Let's settle back again. We've wandered through daily routines, followed pilgrims and festival-goers, and even counted coins in brothel ledgers. Tonight, let's gently explore the regulations themselves, the laws, inspections, and moral oversight that governed these houses of medieval desire. Because in the Middle Ages, even sin had a bureaucratic rhythm, and it was surprisingly meticulous. Municipal authorities treated brothels as both a necessary evil and a taxable enterprise. The logic was simple: human desire would not disappear, so it was better to regulate it. By concentrating activity in specific, licensed locations, the city minimized street-side chaos, theft, or disorderly conduct. The brothel became a controlled environment, where rules could be enforced, fines levied, and revenue collected. Rules covered nearly every aspect of life inside the house. Women were often required to register with local authorities, provide a brief description, and agree to abide by house regulations. Many cities mandated dress codes, sometimes simple, sometimes oddly specific. In parts of Germany, women had to wear certain colored caps or scarves to indicate their profession. In France, yellow badges or special garments identified them. The idea was both practical and symbolic: visibility for oversight, a subtle stigma for moral control. Clients, too, faced rules. No fighting, no theft, no bringing weapons inside. Some brothels had limits on the duration of visits or the number of services provided. Inspections were frequent. Municipal officers or local constables would periodically enter to ensure compliance. Women had to maintain health and hygiene standards, often vague by modern understanding but strictly monitored in documentation. A missed rule could result in fines, removal from the city registry, or even brief imprisonment. Health regulations were particularly interesting. Cities feared outbreaks of disease, which could disrupt labor, commerce, and tax collection. Women were sometimes required to undergo medical checks, often perfunctory and sometimes humiliating. Chroniclers describe inspections that included checking for visible sores, overall cleanliness, and adherence to dress codes. There was no understanding of bacteria, of course, but the effort reflected a practical awareness that illness could threaten the city's economic and social stability. Madams played a crucial role in enforcement. They were the managers, disciplinarians, and accountants all in one, ensuring that women adhered to rules, that clients behaved, and that payments were properly distributed fell to them. Chroniclers often note madams keeping meticulous records, managing disputes, and negotiating with city officials. In a sense, they were the linchpins of municipal oversight, quietly controlling both desire and order. Fines were another tool of regulation. If a woman refused to follow dress codes, entertained underage clients, or quarreled with a madam, she could be fined or temporarily barred from work. Clients who misbehaved faced similar consequences: fines, public shaming, or temporary bans. Sometimes the fines were symbolic, more about demonstrating authority than extracting revenue. Other times, they were substantial, providing the city with extra income while maintaining moral control. Inspectors and local officials developed surprisingly intricate bureaucracies around these fines. Ledgers recorded each infraction, the date, the person involved, the penalty, and often commentary on behavior. One can imagine a municipal clerk at a candlelit desk, quill scratching across parchment, noting that a merchant refused to pay or that a woman argued with her madam. The meticulousness borders on the absurd, but provides a calm rhythm to the otherwise lively trade. Regulations also extended to the building itself. Brothels were required to maintain order, cleanliness, and sometimes structural safety. Windows had to be functional, fire hazards minimized, and partitions maintained. In some cities, authorities even inspected kitchens and common rooms. The goal was not comfort for pleasure seekers, but containment, preventing disputes, reducing health risks, and ensuring smooth administration. Moral oversight often coexisted uneasily with practical enforcement. Priests preached against vice, bishops occasionally inspected for sin, and city authorities regulated behavior for pragmatic reasons. The contradiction was constant: preach morality while permitting controlled sin, and hope that social stability prevailed. Chroniclers occasionally express mild amusement at this arrangement, remarking on the organized hypocrisy of urban administration. Seasonal enforcement added another layer of complexity. During festivals, fairs, and pilgrimages, temporary brothels sprung up, sometimes beyond the reach of municipal oversight. Cities attempted temporary licenses or fines to maintain control, but the transient nature of these houses made enforcement tricky. Women moved between towns, and clients followed festivals or markets. The system had to be flexible, if grudgingly so. Even outside urban centers, rural brothels faced regulation. Lords of manors often licensed women to serve peasants, soldiers, or travelers, collecting a portion of earnings or fines. Local priests, when they could, monitored behavior, admonished sin, and occasionally provided spiritual guidance. The tension between oversight, moral authority, and practical tolerance played out in quiet, almost sleepy ways across the countryside. Another interesting element was dispute resolution. Fights among women, quarrels with clients, or disagreements between madams and authorities were typically mediated through municipal councils. These hearings were often conducted calmly, with officials taking notes, levying fines, and issuing warnings. Violence was discouraged not because of morality, strictly speaking, but because disorder disrupted economic and social stability. Human behavior was contained, gently, with the soft weight of bureaucracy. In some cities, specialized officers oversaw the brothels. In Florence, for example, inspectors ensured compliance with city regulations, collected fines, and occasionally mediated disputes. In Cologne, municipal officials maintained detailed ledgers tracking earnings, health, and rule infractions. The level of detail is remarkable. It demonstrates a medieval commitment to order, predictability, and, of course, taxation. Let's not forget that these regulations also reflected societal attitudes toward women. Brothel women were officially tolerated but morally suspect. Rules were meant to control, stigmatize, and categorize. Compliance provided protection but also reinforced the social hierarchy. Women learned to navigate this complex web, balancing obedience with agency, and often surviving with remarkable skill. At the same time, clients often ignored the moralizing rhetoric. Men routinely flouted rules, tried to negotiate, or acted impulsively. Enforcement relied heavily on practical mechanisms: fines, temporary exclusion, and public admonishment. Moral education, in contrast, was rarely effective. Chroniclers note, with dry amusement, that regulation worked better when it targeted coins and behavior than hearts or minds. The result was a carefully maintained, low-energy ecosystem. Authorities set the rules, madams enforced them, women complied strategically, and clients participated with varying degrees of obedience. Everything ran slowly, predictably, and with just enough friction to keep chroniclers mildly entertained. It's almost soothing to picture these wheels turning quietly under candlelight, day after day, in towns across Europe. And as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself as one of the city inspectors, quill in hand, ledger open, recording fines, observing rules, and quietly marveling at the predictable chaos of human desire. Gentle question for tonight. Would you have enforced every rule strictly, or let some slip, appreciating the calm rhythm of the system? Softly share your thoughts in the comments as the rest of the world sleeps. Let's settle back into the soft rhythm of medieval life. We've explored clients, festivals, finances, and the tangled web of rules. Tonight, let's shift our attention to the women themselves, the heartbeat of the brothels, whose daily existence combined resilience, strategy, and, occasionally, quiet absurdity. Their lives were governed by health, hygiene, and survival, all under the watchful eyes of madams, officials, and sometimes overzealous clerics. Unlike the neat structures we imagine today, medieval brothels were often cramped, dimly lit, and noisy. Kitchens, bedrooms, and workspaces overlapped. Windows were rare, furniture minimal, and heat inconsistent. Yet women adapted remarkably well. Their survival depended on practical routines: washing, tidying, maintaining their clothing, and, of course, navigating clients with patience and skill. Hygiene was not what modern audiences might expect. Bathing was sporadic, often dependent on water availability, municipal ordinances, or seasonal changes. Some towns required women to bathe before entertaining clients, usually in a shared tub or trough. Others provided no facilities at all. Yet women developed methods, rubbing down with cloths, using scented herbs, or relying on perfumes to mask odors. It was an imperfect system, but functional enough to keep business steady. Clothing played a surprisingly important role. Women had to maintain their appearance to attract clients, but laundering was laborious. Wool and linen required careful washing, drying, and repair. In some cities, municipal authorities set dress codes, requiring certain colors or styles to signify profession and rank. The result: women were skilled in sewing, mending, and improvisation. A torn sleeve or faded garment could mean a reduction in clientele or fines, so appearance was as much a survival skill as hygiene. Health concerns were constant. Disease, injury, and exhaustion were everyday hazards. Sexual activity, combined with crowded living conditions, exposure to weather, and inconsistent nutrition, created real risks. Municipal inspections often focused on visible symptoms: sores, rashes, or other ailments. Women had to navigate these inspections carefully, sometimes hiding evidence of illness to avoid fines, temporary suspension, or public shaming. Madams often acted as first-line caregivers. They distributed herbs, poultices, and remedies, advised women on rest, and mediated conflicts. In larger brothels, rudimentary forms of medical knowledge circulated, often drawn from local apothecaries or herbal guides. Women learned to manage minor injuries, cope with fatigue, and protect themselves from clients who were careless or aggressive. Survival depended as much on practical knowledge as anything else. Nutrition was another subtle challenge. Many brothel women relied on a combination of personal provisions, small meals provided by madams, and leftovers from clients or nearby taverns. Diets were simple and repetitive: bread, cheese, pottage, and occasionally meat. Malnutrition could reduce energy, complicate work, and invite disease. Women had to balance maintaining health with conserving resources, a quiet, everyday struggle that required foresight and planning. Sleep itself was precarious. Beds were often shared or minimal, and privacy was limited. Women developed routines to maximize rest, alternating shifts, using small nooks or benches, or taking brief daytime naps between clients. The rhythm of the day, light, hunger, customer flow, dictated patterns of activity. Sleep was precious, fragmented, and fiercely guarded whenever possible. Mental endurance was equally important. Brothel work demanded patience, diplomacy, and observation. Women navigated temperamental clients, occasional harassment, and the judgment of society while maintaining a semblance of composure. Many developed strategies to cope: storytelling, discreet gossip, and cultivating alliances among peers. The social dynamics inside a brothel could be as complex as any court, if quieter and less ceremonious. Violence, though not constant, was always a risk. Some clients became aggressive, disputes among women occasionally erupted, even madams could enforce discipline with harsh methods. Women learned to recognize warning signs, negotiate boundaries, and, when necessary, involve authorities or trusted allies. Survival was as much about reading human behavior as about hygiene or health. Municipal authorities sometimes intervened in these practical matters. Inspections could require women to bathe, present themselves for evaluation, or prove adherence to dress codes. Clergy occasionally preached about sin, but their influence on day-to-day survival was minor. In reality, women relied on experience, community, and ingenuity. They were the quiet managers of their own well-being. Temporary brothels presented additional challenges. Women traveling with fairs, pilgrimage routes, or armies faced unstable accommodations, limited water, and unpredictable clients. Adaptability was essential. Tents were erected, moved, or shared. Cooking and washing became creative exercises, and women often pooled resources to ensure basic needs were met. The transient nature of these spaces demanded resilience, cooperation, and ingenuity. Even small comforts mattered. A well-placed candle, a clean sheet, or a shared loaf of bread could make a difficult day more bearable. Women developed subtle networks of support, exchanging advice, remedies, and companionship. Humor, sarcasm, and quiet irony were survival tools as much as personality traits. They allowed women to navigate the everyday absurdities of their environment with calm and poise. We must also note the economic dimension of survival. Each woman balanced personal earnings with payments to the madam, taxes, fines, and occasional bribes. Financial management was crucial. Spend too much on personal comfort, and survival became precarious. Spend too little, and morale and health suffered. The interplay of economics, health, and social navigation was constant, quiet, and demanding. Interestingly, some women cultivated minor entrepreneurial strategies. Selling small goods, offering advice or companionship beyond sexual services, and negotiating for higher fees from wealthier clients allowed them to increase autonomy. While subtle, these strategies were vital for long-term survival, especially for those who hoped to save money, leave the trade, or secure a more stable position. And yet, despite challenges, many women found ways to assert control over their environment. The madam provided structure, peers offered advice, municipal rules created predictable patterns, and personal skill, humor, and endurance allowed daily life to continue. The rhythm of work, health maintenance, social negotiation, and strategic survival created a surprisingly coherent, if quiet, system. So as you drift further into sleep, consider the subtle endurance of these women, their creativity, resilience, and quiet control over unpredictable lives. They navigated danger, disease, clients, and municipal oversight with ingenuity and patience. It's a humbling, gently ironic reflection on human adaptability, even in the shadows of city walls and festival tents. And a soft question for tonight. If you had been one of these women, would you have relied on strict routine, alliances, or improvisation to survive each day? Let me know quietly in the comments, imagining the calm focus of daily life in a medieval brothel. Let's settle back once more, letting the quiet rhythm of history ease us toward sleep. We've explored the daily lives, finances, rules, and survival of brothel women. Tonight, let's slowly examine the decline of brothels across medieval and early modern Europe, how reform, moral panic, and social change reshaped the spaces we've been quietly wandering through. For centuries, brothels were tolerated, regulated, and even integrated into urban economies. But beginning in the late 15th and 16th centuries, the tide began to shift. A mix of religious reform, public health concerns, and political change created pressure to reduce, restrict, or close these houses. Cities that had once meticulously counted coins from the trade now faced moral scrutiny, often from both above and below. Religious reformers played a major role. The rise of Protestantism, for example, brought renewed emphasis on personal piety, moral discipline, and the rejection of indulgence. Clergy and reformers preached against prostitution with renewed vigor, framing it as a societal ill rather than a tolerated necessity. Catholic reform movements, too, emphasized chastity, spiritual oversight, and stricter moral codes, even in cities that had long treated brothels pragmatically. Sermons thundered, councils debated, and the moral tone of the streets slowly shifted. Public health concerns added momentum to reform. Epidemics, particularly sexually transmitted infections like syphilis, raised alarm. City authorities, who once valued the revenue, began to fear the broader societal costs of disease. Regulations tightened, inspections became more rigorous, and fines grew more punitive. In some regions, women were removed from urban centers or restricted to limited districts. The delicate balance between moral oversight and practical tolerance began to tip decisively toward restriction. Political pressures also played a role. Monarchs and municipal councils sought to project civic virtue and moral authority. Closing brothels, restricting the mobility of women, or enforcing moral ordinances allowed rulers to assert control while appearing pious. This often coincided with efforts to centralize taxation, enforce civic order, or strengthen municipal oversight. The brothel, once a convenient tool for controlling desire, became a symbol of disorder or moral weakness in public perception. The decline was gradual and uneven. Some cities, like Paris, attempted to consolidate brothels into specific districts, while others, like Geneva or Zurich under Protestant influence, implemented outright closures. Temporary and itinerant brothels became harder to tolerate, and municipal authorities increasingly relied on fines and expulsions to control mobility. The practical tolerance of earlier centuries gave way to a more rigid moral and administrative approach. Women themselves were caught in the transition. Those who had relied on itinerant work during fairs, festivals, or pilgrimages now faced reduced opportunities. Municipal protections eroded, health inspections became stricter, and social stigma intensified. Some women adapted, moving to other towns, taking on different types of labor, or entering marriage when possible. Others faced increased vulnerability, navigating both economic precarity and moral censure. Madams, too, saw their influence decline. The carefully structured houses of regulation and oversight were disrupted. Fines increased, licenses became harder to obtain, and municipal support diminished. The orderly systems that once allowed women to manage risk, maintain hygiene, and navigate client relations were eroded by moralistic intervention. Bureaucracy, once gentle and predictable, became a source of pressure rather than a stabilizing force. Interestingly, reformers often approached the issue with subtle irony. They acknowledged that brothels had previously helped contain vice, reduce disorder, and maintain economic flow, yet now they insisted on closure. Letters and council records show frustration. Shutting brothels often displaced vice rather than eliminating it. Street-side solicitation, clandestine meetings, and hidden networks emerged. The moral panic of the era, it seems, sometimes overlooked the practical consequences of sudden change. Economic repercussions followed. Local businesses, from taverns to bakeries, noticed declines in foot traffic. Municipal revenues decreased, and city authorities had to devise alternative income streams. Some attempted to redirect women into respectable labor, charity work, or household service, though opportunities were limited. The quiet hum of brothel-driven commerce, once predictable, became fragmented and uncertain. Social attitudes shifted as well. Women's visibility in public spaces became more regulated, their morality increasingly scrutinized. Municipal ordinances forbade loitering, enforced curfews, and demanded proof of chastity in some contexts. Public discourse framed brothel women as morally deviant, a shift from earlier pragmatic toleration. The gentle irony is palpable. Society turned against the very individuals whose labor had been quietly integrated into city life for centuries. Temporary brothels along pilgrimage routes and fairs faced similar pressures. Authorities implemented tighter oversight, reduced temporary licenses, and increased penalties. Some women adapted by moving further afield, avoiding jurisdictions with strict enforcement. Others were forced to abandon the trade entirely. Mobility, once a survival strategy, became a liability under the moralizing gaze of reformist authorities. Literary sources and chroniclers of the period reflect the tension. Some express nostalgic awareness of the practicality of brothels, noting how they once managed desire quietly and effectively. Others celebrate moral reform, describing closures as progress, virtue, and social improvement. The contrast between lived experience and moral prescription is striking, and quietly amusing in its persistence over decades. By the 17th century, brothels had largely retreated to urban margins or clandestine spaces. Municipal authorities continued to levy fines and enforce rules, but the open, regulated houses of earlier centuries became rare. Economic pragmatism yielded to moral rigor, leaving women more vulnerable and society more hypocritical, if superficially virtuous. Clerics preached, councils enforced, and life continued with the slow, drowsy rhythm of daily routine, now accompanied by quieter whispers of discontent. And yet, despite restrictions, human behavior remained predictable. Desire did not vanish, merely adapted. Secret houses, itinerant women, and private arrangements ensured that the trade persisted, quietly defying moral oversight. The decline of formal brothels did not end prostitution, it merely transformed it, often making survival more challenging for women and more opaque for authorities. So, as you drift further toward sleep, imagine the streets of a 16th-century city. Some brothels closed, others hidden, women adapting quietly to new rules, and the slow rhythm of commerce and human desire continuing beneath the surface. A gentle reflection on persistence, adaptability, and the ironic endurance of human habits. And here's a soft question for you. If you had been a city official faced with moral reform and declining revenue, would you have tried to maintain brothels under control or enforced strict closure, knowing human desire would persist regardless? Let your thoughts drift into the comments tonight, softly, like the city streets at dusk. Let's settle into our last segment, letting the gentle cadence of history ease us toward sleep. We've wandered through the streets of medieval cities, peeked into brothels, followed itinerant women on pilgrimage routes, counted coins in city ledgers, examined rules and inspections, and witnessed the gradual decline of these spaces. Tonight, let's take a soft, reflective journey through what all of this teaches us about human desire, social order, and the quietly resilient lives of women navigating their world. Brothels, as we've seen, were never simply houses of indulgence. They were pragmatic institutions, economic engines, and social experiments in containment and oversight. Cities tolerated them because desire was inevitable and chaos was costly. The systems of regulation, taxation, and inspection were subtle, deliberate, and surprisingly bureaucratic. It's almost comforting to think that centuries ago, people dealt with human impulses in structured, if somewhat ironic, ways. The women themselves deserve our quiet attention. They were entrepreneurs, caregivers, strategists, and survivalists. Each day involved negotiating client expectations, municipal rules, hygiene, health, and interpersonal dynamics, all under the gaze of madams, inspectors, and sometimes moralizing clergy. Their work required adaptability, patience, and skill. In a way, they orchestrated calm within potential chaos, maintaining routines that allowed urban life to continue smoothly. Temporary brothels, fairs, and pilgrimage routes added further texture to this world. Women moved from town to town, tents and lean-tos rising and falling with festivals and market days. The mobility created both risk and opportunity. Municipal oversight tried to keep pace, clerics protested, and clients followed the ebb and flow of commerce. In this rhythm, the women displayed remarkable ingenuity, quietly mastering travel, negotiation, and survival without fanfare. Economics, as we've discussed, provided the most persistent framework. Coins flowed predictably, collected through licenses, fines, and municipal oversight. Authorities sometimes grumbled at the moral compromises required, yet they relied on the steady, calm revenue. Madams and women managed daily accounting with care, ensuring survival and compliance. Even the church's complaints could not obscure the practicality. Brothels were, in a way, quietly essential. Regulations and inspections, though often tedious, reflect a certain medieval diligence. Officials recorded fines, checked clothing, monitored health, and ensured compliance. The moralizing rhetoric often clashed with practical enforcement, producing a curious balance between order and indulgence. Women, clients, and officials alike learned to navigate this quietly, maintaining routines, observing patterns, and participating in a system that was part governance, part theater. Health and hygiene, as we explored, were constant challenges. Bathing, laundering, nutrition, and sleep were managed under constraints, often creatively. Women adapted to cramped spaces, variable food supplies, and unpredictable clients. They relied on each other, on madams, and on accumulated knowledge to survive, demonstrating resilience that can be almost soothing to imagine. The gentle rhythm of daily routines, washing, dressing, client rotation, rest, formed a predictable cadence that made survival possible. And then came reform, moral panic, and eventual decline. Cities began restricting or closing brothels, driven by religious, social, and public health pressures. Women lost protections, mobility became riskier, and municipal revenue decreased. Yet human desire persisted. Secret houses, itinerant work, and discreet arrangements continued, quietly defying moral authority. The decline illustrates a recurring theme in our exploration. Regulation can shape behavior, but it rarely eliminates underlying impulses. Through all of this, the irony is subtle, dry, and gently humorous. Authorities condemned vice while profiting from it. Women navigated rules intended to control them while exercising agency and ingenuity. Clerics preached morality even as coins flowed from sin into municipal coffers. Life was messy, structured, and quietly absurd, exactly the kind of thing that makes history both relaxing and strangely comforting to contemplate. As we draw this journey to a close, it's worth reflecting on the enduring lessons. Brothels were spaces where desire, economics, regulation, and social norms intersected. They reveal the practical pragmatism of cities, the resilience of women, and the gentle absurdities of human nature. They were neither heroic nor glamorous, merely functional, predictable, and quietly complex. So, as you drift further toward sleep, imagine the soft flicker of candlelight in a city brothel, the quiet shuffle of footsteps along cobblestone streets, the subtle hum of economic transactions, and the gentle navigation of daily life by women who knew how to survive, adapt, and endure. The world moved slowly, predictably, and yet with all the muted drama of human habits continuing across centuries. If you've enjoyed wandering through these quiet streets, imagining the rhythm of life inside and around brothels, take a moment to reflect. How do modern cities still manage desire, commerce, and morality today, in ways both subtle and absurd? It's a gentle thought to carry into your dreams tonight. And before we fully close the curtain on this long exploration, a soft invitation. If you found this journey calming, enlightening, or quietly amusing, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your engagement supports more gentle historical narratives like this, allowing us to explore the overlooked, strange, and often quietly humorous corners of history together. Leave a comment if something from tonight's journey particularly caught your imagination. Perhaps the meticulous ledgers, the itinerant women at fairs, or the ironic interplay of morality and revenue. Your reflections help continue the conversation softly, gently, and thoughtfully. Thank you for drifting along these quiet paths of history with me. May your sleep be restful, your dreams lightly ironic, and your curiosity always gently stirred by the small, hidden stories of our past. Good night.